Great. So now we have our income statement, but our next tip is to enable us to actually show it like an income statement is formatted. And one of the main differences between what we've got now and how an income statement should look is the omission of subtotals here. So when we develop an income statement, we have revenue, cost of sales, and then we have the gross profit or the gross margin underneath that. And then we have operating expenses, other expenses, and we might have another subtotal that says profit before tax or profit after operating expenses. And actually, if I show you an example of how an income statement looks, we can see here, for example, we've got net revenue, net sales, and then we've got cost of sales, and then gross profit. And this gross profit is that minus that, or if that one's negative, then the sum of those two above it. And then we have operating expenses. Again, if these were negative, the operating income will be a subtotal of all of the subtotals above it. So this is what we would achieve, for example, using the subtotal function in Excel. So very easy to do in Excel, slightly more complicated in Power BI, but just forces you to think a little bit about how Power BI works from a DAX perspective. So actually, if we go back into our headers, we can see we actually have those header lines in here. And this is this tip, is when you have a table that has all of your lines in there, including subtotals. You'll see there's nothing shown under that, and we'll come back to why that is in a moment, but we've got them here in terms of an order. So we've got revenue, net sale, cost of sales, gross margin, and then we've got calculation type. And one, it basically indicates that it comes from an FS line, so it's part of the header assignment. So we'll have accounts with a header assignment of revenue, and here we'll have accounts with a header assignment of net sales. And cost of sales. And then the calc type 2 indicates that it's a subtotal. So net sales is a subtotal of revenue. Gross margin is a subtotal of revenue and cost of sales. So obviously excluding the other subtotals and so on. So let's go back to our income statement here. And firstly, let's have a look at actually what happens if we show why we don't see those totals in here, because we dragged on header, and yet we don't see all of the rows for header. We only see revenue, cost of sales, operating expenses. We don't see any of those subtotal lines. And the reason for that is because those subtotal lines have no data against them, because we're bringing data in from our transaction table. And so when those filters flow through the transaction table, it's saying that there's no data against them. So this is why if we go into here, and we go into header and we do show items with no data, now we can see they're actually coming up. So we've got net sales, but it's blank. We've got gross margin, but it's blank. And the reason it's blank is because there's no rows in the transaction table that relates to a header of gross margin. So actually what we need to do is do it as a calculation. So actually, it's a separate calculation for these rows. Now, if these were all custom calculations, then we could potentially have a DAX measure that says, look at what the name of this is, and if it's gross margin, do this calculation. If it's operating profit, do this calculation, and then we can have a dynamic measure like we did for the period selection to be able to show things here. Now, we can do slightly simpler than that, because if we actually look at these headers, we've got an order column. So actually, we can do, the order of all of those less than the current. So actually, we can say cost of sales is going to be anything with an order less than, gross margin is going to be anything less than order less than 4. So it's going to sum through 1, 2, and 3. And 2 will be blank in the context we calculated, so it'll just be the 1 and the 3. And then we can do the same thing with operating profit. We can say, give me the subtotal of anything with an order less than 6. So let's firstly just pick out that order. So how do we know what the order is for each row on here? Now, when we had a slicer selection, we used selected value. And actually, we could use the same thing here, because even though we're not selecting a value, so it's not selected value in the literal sense, it's the value in the current filter context. So if we did here in revenue, we will be able to pull out the selected value, which is the value in the current filter context, off that row in that table, in our headers table. So if we go into here now and we do let's just create a new measure, and let's call this totals. So let's just do order for header in current filter context. Just I'm going to make this really explicit, just so we're clear on this call. We don't need to call it out in real life. So let's call this selected value. So we want to do the selected value, even though it's not filtered from there, and then do dim headers order. And this is going to give us the order number for that header in this filter context. So now if we drag on this field in here, we can see it's expanded everything out. We've got number 1 for revenue, we've got 2 for net sales, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and we've got a blank for profit after tax. And actually what we can do, we can do that as maybe we want that to be the highest number that exists, the highest order number. So for profit after tax, so back in our order for header and current filter context, selected value, and then we can do max dim headers. So if it's not, there's not one in filter context, so this always means there's one value in the filter context, either from a slicer selection or say rows against a table or axes against a chart. So here we say whatever that order number is, we do that. If this alternate result, so i.e. if we don't have one value in filter context, then we can do the maximum value. So dim headers order, and that should give us 9 there as well, which is the highest number. So again, that will be net income there. We've already got a total in it here, but otherwise they'll be the same thing. So we can actually get rid of totals on this, but even if we didn't, we could do it this way. So now we need to have a formula that's going to basically say to us do a running total. So it's very much like a cumulative total that we have, say, for dates, and there's lots of patterns out there for cumulative totals. We need to follow a very similar pattern for our running total here. So we say for gross margin, give us a subtotal of the 1 and the 3. So anything less than those. And then again for operating profit, we can say we want anything where the order number is less than 6. So anything in those. So now let's go back to our orders on here, and let's just create a new measure that's going to be able to do that for us. So now if we do actuals by period running total. So firstly, what you want to do is work out what that order number is that's in the current filter context. So we just created a measure for that. So current order number, header order number, maybe we should call it current header order number. Otherwise we're thinking of sales orders or something. Current header order number equals, and we can just refer to the measure order for the header in the current filter context. And now what we want to do is calculate. So we want to return our actuals by period, but we want to calculate it for where our order number in dim headers is less than our current header order number. So now we've got our formula there. So we've got current header order number is just it's our selected value. Return actuals by period, calculate, so give us our actuals by period in the filter context of where our dim headers order is less than our current header order number. Now the challenge is anytime we refer to something like this, we're also looking at it in the current filter context. So this will give us on row 1 where we've got revenue, that will give us 1, and it will say 1 is less than 1 because that's our current, and then it will say 2 is less than 2, 3 is less than 3, and because we do less than, it will actually give us blanks. So what we need to do is to say calculate that, but actually consider the whole headers table, not just the current row that I've got selected. So we can bring in another thing in there, another filter condition for all dim headers. So calculate actuals by period in the context of all of our header table, and calculate for where the order is less than the current header order number. And now that should give us our running total. So a very similar pattern to what we use for cumulative totals. And if we drag that into here, we should be able to see that this is giving us the right running total. So 7 million, and then we go down to we've got a value there, a loss there of 2 million. So we start with 7 million, which is our revenue, then hit a loss of 2 million in cost of sales, a negative number. So now we go down, our running total gets down to 5 million. We've got a cost of operating expenses of 3 million. So then our running total goes down to 1.8 million. And so on, and then taxes, and it goes down to 1395. So what we want to do now, we've got this running total, but we want to show essentially exact when the calc type is 1, i.e. when it's coming from our account lines, it's got a relationship to our dim account, so return something, then return whatever it's going to return. In those rows where it was blank, essentially, where we've got a different calc type, then we can say return the running total. And then, so we have a dynamic measure. So we're going to use another dynamic measure very similar to what we did there. And let's just go back to our dim headers table. So we've got calc type, and let's just create a new measure based on that as well. So now we've got actuals, running total, or account sum, accounts. So firstly, what we can do is say, let's just pick out a variable that says what is our current calc type. Current calc type equals, and again, we can do selected value, or we could do, let's do selected value. So selected value, calc type, dim headers calc type. And if nothing, as an alternative, we'll just give it, again, the max calc type. So this is going to return us either 1 or 2. All right, so now we can do current calc type. So if it's 1, then we want to just do our actuals by period. So if it's coming from the accounts, we can just give it our actuals by period and it'll calculate that. If it's a number 2, then we can give it our running total, actuals by period running total. And if it's none of those, let's just return blank. So now we've got our actuals running total. So we just based it on the calc type, and then we give it a 1. If it's coming from, if it's a line like revenue, we just pick up our revenue totals. If it's a line like gross margin, then we give it the running total calculation that we just did on there. And now running total or accounts, you drag that in there. Let's take off these others. And here, now we should have our net. So here, then we have in our top headings, we have revenue. Net sales is the same because we've got nothing else that's coming under there. Cost of sales is negative number, so then our gross margin is that number there. And operating expenses, operating profit, other income expenses. So we probably wouldn't have this as a drill through on here. We'd have it as a kind of fixed format statement, so we can turn off those headers and just keep the header line. And then we've got revenue, 7 million, cost of sales, gross margin, and that allows us then to be able to have our kind of fixed format income statement.